What's up, guys? Study Times here. In this video, we're going to talk about necrosis and the different types of necrosis in our body. So, what is necrosis? When the cells in our body die because of a lot of reasons, we call it necrosis. It can happen due to external or internal reasons. External can be infection or very hot or very cold environment, and internal can be because of ischemia, which means the lower blood supply to some part of the body. And so the amount of oxygen or nutrients to that part of the body are gonna be lower, and that can kill the cells and kill the tissue at the end. We have different types of necrosis, and we're going to talk about each separately in this video, and what exactly it happens, and in what part of the bodies they are most common. One of the ways that necrosis can start is with the oncosis. What is oncosis? When the toxins or ischemia damage the mitochondria. This is my mitochondria. When some toxins or ischemia can damage the mitochondria is not able to produce ATP anymore. And on the cell, in the cell membrane, we have something called sodium potassium ATPase. And because it's an ATPase, it's a pump, so it needs ATP. And its job is it pumps out sodium ions outside the cell and potassium ions inside the cells. And because we don't have any more ATP because of the damage of mitochondria, so this pump is not going to work anymore. So the sodium ions are going to build up in the cell, and as you know, in all places in the body, when you have sodium, it just attracts water with itself. So the water goes inside too, and that makes the cells to swallow. The cell keeps swallowing, and at the end, it just bursts, and the contents inside the cell just go out into the environment, so between the cells. And that one attracts the immune cells, and the immune cells go there and start the inflammatory process. The immune cells release proteases, which are enzymes that cleave the proteins, and some reactive oxygen species for the inflammatory process. They release these, and that destroys the tissue. And at the end, if it's in a very big amount, it can even make the organ dysfunction. So this is oncosis, which is one of the ways that the necrosis can start. So there are 6 types of necrosis: coagulative, gangrenous, which they usually occur because of hypoxia, so low amount of oxygen for the tissue. Liquefactive, which usually happens because of the hydrolytic enzymes. Caseous usually happens because of the tuberculosis. Fat necrosis, fatty acids usually come out from the adipose cells, usually because of trauma. And fibrinoid necrosis, the fibrin from the blood gets deposits to the walls usually, and it's because of the most common is because of the malignant hypertension. So because the pressure in the blood is so high, it makes the fibrin to deposit. So we're gonna talk about each separately. Don't worry about it. We're gonna dissect each one. So the first type is coagulative necrosis. It usually happens because of hypoxia. What hypoxia means? It means a low amount of oxygen to the tissue. So when the blood supply goes less, the amount of oxygen to the tissue goes less, and that makes the proteins in the tissue to change their shape. And as you know, the proteins have a very special 3D structure. So when the shape and the 3D structure of the proteins get changed, they cannot work anymore. So one of the main important proteins that cannot work is the lysosomal enzymes. So the enzymes, which are proteins in the lysosome, they change their shape so they cannot work properly. And when they cannot work properly, they cannot get removed. They cannot hydrolyze and get removed of those proteins that change their shape. So we have some affected proteins, and those proteins are going to stay in the cell because the lysosomes are not able to remove them anymore. So, how it's gonna look like macroscopically, like when you look at the tissue itself, it's kind of gel-like and it's pale when you look at it. And it can occur in basically all cells and all tissues, but most commonly it usually happens in the heart and spleens and kidney. So when you have lower amount of oxygen to heart or spleen or kidney, you usually have coagulative necrosis. The other type is liquefactive necrosis. In this one, we have hydrolytic enzymes which completely digest the dead cells. And when it happens, we end up with some creamy substance which are the dead immune cells. It mostly happen in the brain, but also it can happen in the pancreas or abscesses in all over the body. Let's see how the liquefactive necrosis happen in the brain. In the brain, we have some macrophages called macroglial cells, as you can see here. These macroglial cells are filled with the hydrolytic enzymes. They have a lot of hydrolytic enzymes. And these hydrolytic enzymes go and completely destroy the damaged brain cells, and they make them into some creamy liquid substance. So they basically liquefy the dead cells. Similarly, in the pancreas, we have pancreatic enzymes like trypsin. And that trypsin sometimes gets activated when it is still in the pancreas by gallstones, like stones in the gallbladder or alcohol consumption. And when these trypsin or pancreatic enzymes get activated, they can destroy the pancreas itself, and that makes the pancreas to undergo liquefactive necrosis. And in the abscesses, we have some type of the white blood cells called neutrophils. And these type of cells, they have proteolytic enzymes. And that enzyme can liquefy the tissue. So we have liquefactive necrosis. And when it does that, it produces a substance called pus inside the abscesses, as you know. Another type of necrosis is gangrenous necrosis. It usually happens because of hypoxia, just like coagulative necrosis. So that's why some people consider them as just coagulative necrosis. Like they don't consider gangrenous necrosis as another type. They just consider them as a type of coagulative necrosis. But in some books, you find them in different categories. So about gangrenous necrosis, we have two type of gangrene. It's called dry or wet gangrene. In the dry one, the tissue is just dried up. It's just dry. Gangrenous necrosis is dry. But in the wet one, when the dry gangrene becomes infected, it becomes wet and it becomes a type of liquefactive necrosis actually. So in that situation, they call it wet gangrene. The other type of necrosis is caseous necrosis. It usually happens because of some fungi or some microbacteria like tuberculosis. And in this type, the cells disintegrate, but they are not fully digested. And the appearance is like a cottage cheese-like shape of the tissue. Another type of necrosis is fat necrosis. It can happen due to some trauma to fatty organs like pancreas or breasts. And as you can see here, this is a fat cell. And when there is a trauma to that organ, the cell membrane ruptures, it ruptures, and the fats or triglycerides, they come out of the cell and they go into the intercellular space between the cells. In there, they bind to calcium ions and they make decalcification in the tissue. And when you look at it, it's like a chalk-like structure. Fat necrosis can happen in the pancreas too, and it can happen due to inflammation. We call it pancreatitis, which means inflammation of the pancreas. And when it happens, the pancreatic cells, they just pull out the lipase, which is an enzyme that digests the lipids. As the name is telling you, lipase is not lipids, ACE is the enzyme. So it digests the lipids. And when it happens, it digests the fatty tissue in the retroperitoneum, which is close to and adjacent to the pancreas. And that can make them to undergo fat necrosis. So finally, we have fibrinoid necrosis. It can happen due to a malignant hypertension, which means when your blood pressure is high for a long time. Or it can happen due to vasculitis, which means the inflammatory reaction in the wall of the vessels. So, in the wall of the vessels. So, both of them, they actually damage the wall of the small arteries. And when it happens, the fibrin, which is a protein in the blood, can infiltrate to the wall of the arteries and it can damage them.